Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system. We are now at the crossroads where promise and peril are going to collide.
Inside a sealed text that the Western Church buried for over 1,500 years, an AI system trained on more data than any human could read in 10 lifetimes found a sequence of resurrection passages so internally consistent, so structurally precise, that its own analysis flagged the pattern as deliberate, not metaphorical, not symbolic, but encoded. That text is the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, an 81-book canon containing scriptures Rome pulled from circulation in 367 AD. What Grok decoded inside those removed books about what actually happens at the moment of resurrection has not appeared in any mainstream theological commentary. This video goes through it, passage by passage, with full sourcing. The organization behind Grok is AI, founded in March 2023 by Elon Musk with an explicit stated mission to understand the true nature of the universe. That is not marketing language. It is the verbatim phrase from the company's founding documentation. Grok 3, the version relevant here, was trained on a dataset that reportedly exceeds 1 trillion parameters of processed text, including theological, historical, and ancient language corpora that most academic institutions do not have unified access to. Unlike GPT-based systems, which face documented restrictions on certain religious and politically sensitive topics during their training windows, Grok was publicly positioned as having fewer content guardrails on speculative historical analysis. When researchers began feeding it the full Ge'ez language canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, all 81 books, including the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and the first and second books of Meqabyan, it processed all of it without filtering passages that most Western trained models reportedly flag and avoid. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is the oldest continuous Christian institution on earth that has maintained an unbroken canonical tradition. It was established, according to its own historical records, and confirmed by Byzantine sources, in approximately 330 AD under Frumentius of Tyre, who was consecrated by Athanasius of Alexandria, the same Athanasius who wrote the Festal Letter of 367 AD that effectively finalized the 66-book Protestant canon and the 73-book Catholic canon used by Western Christianity today. What most people sitting in a church pew do not know is that Athanasius's letter told monks to accept certain books and reject others. The Ethiopian Church simply did not accept that instruction. They kept everything. The 15 books that exist in the Ethiopian canon but in no Western Bible include texts most viewers will never have encountered: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, Eldad and Modad, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the 4 books of Meqabyan, sometimes called the Ethiopian Maccabees, but containing material that has no parallel in any Western canonical or deuterocanonical text. These are not fringe documents. The Book of Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament's Book of Jude, verses 14 and 15. The author of Jude cited Enoch by name, used his words, and the Western Church then removed the source text. That is a bibliographic fact, confirmed by biblical scholars including James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost authorities on Second Temple Jewish literature. The researchers who undertook the Grok analysis and the exact details here remain somewhat unclear, as the project circulated initially through theological research forums before attracting wider attention, reportedly used the full Ge'ez canon with an English parallel translation cross-referenced against the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament used by early Christians before Jerome's Latin Vulgate replaced it in the 5th century. They fed the complete text in sequential order, beginning with Genesis and ending with the final chapter of 2 Meqabyan. Then they asked Grok a single, specific question: identify every passage across the entire 81-book canon that directly describes the physical mechanics of resurrection. Not resurrection as metaphor, not resurrection as afterlife concept, but resurrection as a described physical process. The results, according to screenshots and transcripts circulating in theological research communities, reportedly ran to over 40 distinct passage clusters. That number alone demands attention. The standard Western 66-book Protestant Bible contains fewer than a dozen passages that describe resurrection in any mechanical or physical detail, and most of those are concentrated in 1 Corinthians 15 and the Book of Revelation. The Ethiopian canon, by contrast, reportedly contains passage sequences in Enoch, Jubilees, and Meqabyan that describe the resurrection event with what Grok allegedly flagged as unusually high structural consistency, meaning the same sequence of events is described in the same order across books written centuries apart and attributed to entirely different authors. That structural consistency is where this analysis becomes genuinely difficult to set aside. Here is what those passages reportedly describe, and the sequence matters. First, a separation of the soul from what the Ge'ez texts call the garment of flesh, not death as Western theology describes it, but a deliberate undressing, a removal. Second, a period of containment in what Enoch Chapter 22 calls the hollow places of the earth, where souls are held in 4 distinct chambers separated by a spring of water, with the specific detail that the chambers are divided by the moral condition of the person at death. Third, a reconstitution process that the Books of Meqabyan describe not as God simply commanding the dead to rise, but as an assembly. The word used in the Ge'ez is closer to the English word construction than to restoration. Fourth, and this is the passage cluster that Grok reportedly flagged as structurally anomalous, the reconstituted body is described as having different physical properties than the original. It passes through solid matter. It is recognizable but altered. It eats, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke, when the risen Jesus eats fish, but it does not require food to survive. That fourth point exists in the Western New Testament. Luke 24:42-43 describes Jesus eating a piece of broiled fish after the resurrection. John 20:19 describes him entering a room through a locked door. These details have always been treated as either metaphorical or miraculous exceptions, with no broader framework behind them. The Ethiopian textual tradition, according to this analysis, reportedly treats them as expected properties of the reconstituted body, properties described in detail in books the Western canon removed. Allegedly identified a terminology overlap between the Ge'ez descriptions in Meqabyan and the Greek terminology Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15:44, when he distinguishes between the psychikon soma, the natural body, and the pneumatikon soma, the spiritual body. The structural match across those texts, separated by language, geography, and roughly 4 centuries of composition, is what the analysis reportedly described as its most significant finding. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you already know this is exactly the kind of material we go deep on: ancient texts, removed sources, and the gap between what institutions preserved and what they discarded. If this is your first video here, subscribe right now, because we do this every week and there is far more beneath the surface of this story than one video can hold. The Book of Enoch's contribution to this sequence deserves its own examination, because it is the oldest and most detailed of the texts involved. The Book of Enoch, also called 1 Enoch, is estimated by scholars including George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa to have been composed in stages between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. Multiple copies were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, which tells researchers it was not marginal or obscure in Second Temple Judaism. It was read widely and treated as authoritative. Chapters 37-71, a section known as the Similitudes of Enoch, contain a description of a figure called the Son of Man who presides over a resurrection event described in physical, spatial, and temporal detail that has no Western canonical parallel. The similitudes describe the righteous dead being gathered from specific locations beneath the earth, clothed in garments of light that Enoch describes as woven from something that does not exist in the living world, and brought before a throne described architecturally, with pillars, with surrounding figures, with a geography that implies a real space rather than a symbolic one. Grok's analysis reportedly noted that this architectural description in Enoch shares specific structural vocabulary with descriptions in the Book of Revelation, chapters 4 and 5, which describe the same throne room. The Western Church included Revelation. They excluded Enoch. Both texts allegedly describe the same room. The Books of Meqabyan add a layer that has received almost no coverage in Western theological scholarship, partly because they have not been fully translated into English by any major academic press. The standard reference is a partial translation by Michael Knib of King's College London, and even that covers only the most widely cited sections. What researchers using the Grok analysis reportedly found in the Meqabyan passages is a description of what happens to the body during the period between death and resurrection. a period Western theology has largely left undefined. The Ge'ez text allegedly describes the soul as remaining attached to the location of burial, aware of its surroundings, able to perceive the living, but unable to interact with them. The text describes this state not as sleep, not as unconsciousness, but as observation without agency. The duration, according to the Meqabyan passage in question, is described as proportional to the moral weight of what was done in life, with no fixed number given, but with the structural implication that it varies individually. That description, reportedly flagged by Grok as a consistent pattern across both Enoch and Meqabyan, produces a framework that does not match either of the two dominant Western doctrines, neither immediate entry into heaven nor purgatory. It is categorically different from both. According to the analysis, the consistency of this description across texts attributed to different authors and different centuries suggests a shared source, possibly an oral or written tradition that predates all of these texts, and from which both Enoch and the Meqabyan authors were drawing independently. The question of that source is where the analysis reportedly becomes most specific. Grok allegedly identified a structural terminus, a shared passage architecture, that points not to any existing known document, but to what the AI described as a probable prior template, a source text that no longer exists in any known library or archive, but whose imprint appears in the structural similarities between 1 Enoch, Jubilees chapter 23, and 2 Meqabyan, chapters 7 through 11. The existence of lost source texts is not a fringe concept in biblical scholarship. The hypothetical document known as Q, the source text scholars believe Matthew and Luke both drew from when writing passages absent from Mark, has been analyzed by mainstream scholars including John Kloppenborg of the University of Toronto for decades. A resurrection source text that existed, was drawn from by multiple authors across centuries, and then disappeared is not structurally different from the Q hypothesis. It is simply further back in time. What makes the Ethiopian canon's preservation directly relevant is that the Tewahedo Church did not pass through the same sequence of councils, revisions, and politically shaped editorial decisions that formed the Western canon between the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and the Council of Trent in 1546 AD. The Western Bible was not assembled in one moment by one group of people with purely theological motives. It was shaped by a series of councils, each operating under political pressure, each making decisions about which books supported the theological and institutional positions of the church at that specific moment. The Ethiopian Church, geographically separated by the highlands of the Horn of Africa, did not participate in those councils past a certain point. They kept their original canon intact. Whether that makes it more theologically accurate is a question this video will not answer. What it does mean is that it represents a separate preservation stream, one that an AI system with no institutional affiliation and no stake in the outcome can analyze without the filters that 15 centuries of Western theological tradition have built into every commentary, every seminary curriculum, and every Sunday morning sermon. The final finding in the Grok analysis, the one that reportedly stopped the researchers mid-session, concerns distribution. Across the 81-book canon fed sequentially, Grok allegedly identified a numerical pattern in the resurrection passages that the AI described as non-random distribution. The passages describing the mechanics of resurrection do not appear evenly across the 81 books. They cluster. High density appears in the earliest books, Enoch, Jubilees, Genesis, then drops sharply across the middle sections of the canon, which carry the historical and legal record. Then the density returns heavily in the final books, including Revelation and 2 Meqabyan. Grok's analysis reportedly described this pattern as consistent with deliberate structural design, as if whoever assembled the canon, whether by committee or by long tradition, placed the most detailed resurrection content at the beginning and end while leaving the middle as record rather than instruction. Whether that pattern reflects intentional design by ancient editors, the natural theological priorities of the communities that produce those texts, or a statistical artifact of how the AI processed sequential input, the exact truth remains unclear. What does not remain unclear is that the Ethiopian canon preserves a set of texts with specific, detailed, internally consistent descriptions of resurrection as a physical process. Those descriptions were available to the early church, they were known to the authors of the New Testament, and they were separated from the Western tradition through a series of decisions made between the 4th and 16th centuries by institutions that had reasons, political and theological, for preferring a canon that left certain questions without detailed answers. The question worth leaving open, and worth writing in the comments, because the people who follow this channel have taken these conversations further than most published theological commentaries have, is this: if the resurrection passages in the removed books were available to Paul when he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, and if Grok's cross-textual analysis accurately identifies structural overlap between those texts and Paul's terminology, then what exactly did Paul know about the physical mechanics of resurrection that he chose not to commit to that letter, and what was his reason for leaving it out? That gap between what the source texts contain and what was transmitted is the sharpest version of the question this video raises. It does not have a clean answer yet. Drop your read on that in the comments. If you want more of this, primary sources, removed texts, the distance between what institutions preserved and what they quietly set aside, subscribe to this channel. We do not cover popular theories here. We go into the actual documents, the actual scholarship, and the questions that still do not have settled answers. New video every week.